Hey everybody, JR from JR's Cars here, and as you can see in the background, we got a new car to work on. So if you're driving around and your car sounds like this, stay tuned, because we're going to be fixing that today. Alright everybody, so like I said in the intro, we got a new car to work on. So this here is a 2014 Jeep Patriot. This is the four-wheel drive version, not just the front-wheel drive. So the noise that you heard in the intro, I pinpointed it down to a wheel bearing. So one thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to determine which wheel it is. Obviously you have four, so you're going to have to determine whether it's the front or the rear. And then afterwards, you're going to have to determine whether it's the driver's side or the passenger side. So I've already determined that it's going to be one of the rear wheel bearings. The way to determine that, obviously, is if you're driving in the front of the car and you don't hear it as much in the front, you would have somebody else drive the car, and then you could sit in the back seat and listen to hear if the noise is a little bit louder in the rear. This one definitely has the noise more in the rear of the car. And in the clip that I'm going to show you in a second here, it'll give you a little tip here to show you how to determine whether it's going to be the driver's side or if it's going to be the passenger side. Now, when I turn the wheel to the right, if I was doing about 40-45 miles an hour, when I turn the wheel to the right and we go around a right curve, the noise lessens a little bit. So what's happening is the pressure's coming off of that rear right wheel, and that's going to relieve some of the pressure on that wheel bearing. That way it's going to lessen the noise. Now, if I turn the wheel to the left and the noise started going away, it started lessening, it would have told me that it was the driver's side rear wheel bearing that was going bad. Now, I've already replaced, because I was just going to do them in pairs anyway, I already replaced the driver's side rear wheel bearing, and the noise didn't go away. So today, we're going to be replacing the passenger side one, and then we'll take it for a ride and see if that fixes our problem. Alright, so first things first, obviously, like I say in all my other videos, you have to make sure you're doing this smart. You have to make sure you're safe, make sure that you have the wheels chalked in the front, make sure that you have your jack underneath that's secure, make sure that you're on level ground, and make sure you have a jack stand underneath the car too so it doesn't go anywhere. One more thing to point out, and this goes for all you shop owners and all you mechanics that works in shops, and you know, you're commission based or you're trying to get things done quickly. Don't use the air tools to torque down the lug nuts. There's no reason to torque the shit out of these things. I actually had to use a breaker bar and my long bar to get two of these bolts off. The lug nuts should really only be torqued down to about 100 foot-pounds. If you're wondering how tight they should be, you should look in your owner's manual and it'll tell you that. But I mean, if you're going to use air tools, at least use the torque sticks that limit you. Okay, so with that out of the way, obviously we took the tire off. So one thing that you're going to have to do is on these Jeeps, you're going to pop that center cap out from the backside. Flip the tire over and you can pop that center cap out, because after we start lubing this up and we take this cotter pin out, we take the covering off, the keeper for the axle nut, we're going to have to remove the axle nut itself. And the axle nut's on there with about 200 foot-pounds of torque. So, and looking at this, you can see it's kind of rusty too. So after we lube this up with some good lube, we're gonna have to put the tire back on the car, put the car back on the ground so it has all its weight on it, and then you're gonna take that axle nut off. So Let's get this cotter pin out. Let's get the axle covering off. We'll spray it in there. We'll let it sit for a couple minutes, and then we'll come back and take that axle nut out. On this Jeep, the axle nut is a 1 1/4 inch nut. So what we're going to do is we'll have this on my long bar. We're going to get it in here. We're going to set it up, and that's why I told you to take the cap out, so you can get into the axle now that the car's on the ground. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my long bar, put it on the end here. All right, so we have some leverage. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and break that nut free. And then what you're going to want to do after that nut is broken free is you're going to want to, little by little, loosen, tighten, because as you loosen, it's going to break free some of that rust that's around the threads in the axle. So you don't want that binding up, because that's going to cause bigger issues. So by you loosening it up and then tightening it back, you can clean the thread part of it to get any of that rust residue out of it, which will make it easier to get the axle nut completely off. Okay, so after the axle nut is off, that's what you should have, is some nice good clean threads like that if you did this good. And then you can see in there, that's your pinhole for the cotter pin. So at this point now, what we have to do is we have to take the caliper bracket off, and then we're going to take this rotor off, which will give us access to the wheel bearing. Okay, so this is what we're after right now. All right, so this is your wheel bearing. And if you look in here, it might be a little hard to see, but you can see this is the entire wheel bearing here. And then in there, you see right where my finger is, that's one of the bolts that's coming in from the back side. There's another bolt up here, and then on the other side is pretty much the same thing. Let's see if I can get you in there. See that one right down in the bottom there. This one right here. And right in there too. Now what it is you're going to have to get these from the back side. So if you look behind here, you have your axle, right? You have your axle that comes in, and hidden back here are the 4 bolts. You're going to have to basically just put your fingers in there, feel where the bolts are, and then you're going to have to get them loose. You could see that I have the ratchet right here. You have the socket, it's a 17 millimeter socket, and then I have about a 3-inch extension. On the one side, you're going to be able to use this. On the other side, you just use the socket itself, and you should be good to go. So it's the 4 bolts. We'll take those out, and what that's going to do is it's going to take this entire assembly, along with the backing plate, it's going to take that off. You don't have to take off the emergency brakes here. So this can stay on. And then what we're going to do is, after this whole assembly comes out, we're going to beat it from the back side. The whole wheel bearing will come out, and then you put the new one in, put it back on, and tighten everything back up. So I'm going to get those 4 bolts out, and then I'll show you what it looks like with the backing plate off. All right, if you take a look here, you can see where the bolts are on the back side. Those 2 are pretty easily accessible. You just have to watch. You see where that little clamp is. You might have to move the axle around a little bit just to get to those bolts. And if you look on this side, you can see where the 2 bolts are on this side too. These are a little bit more difficult to get to. They're not impossible. They're just a little bit, it's going to take you a little bit longer to get into them. So with those bolts out, one more thing, you can see that cable that's right there. That's for the ABS sensor. That goes through the body here. All right, just to give yourself some extra room, because this is the ABS sensor cable. You want to take this, and you want to pop that through the keeper so you get some slack in this line here. That's the ABS sensor cable. And then you want to take this 13 millimeter bolt out. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you plenty of slack here, that when you get this, when you pull the wheel bearing out along with the backing plate, it's going to give you enough room to then take that off of the ABS sensor without breaking it, making sure that you don't break that clip. Okay, so after you take that 13 millimeter out and that little clip out there, that gives you plenty of slack here for when you go to take this out. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a hammer, just beat down on your wheel bearing, and just keep hitting it back and forth. And what you're going to see is you can see this backing plate coming loose, and the whole thing's going to come out for you. All right, this one's a little stubborn, so I'm going to take this out and I'll come back. Okay, so basically we were just hung up on the axle there. It's not a big deal. As you can see, it's got a little bit of rust on it, so when you're taking this out, you're going to want to make sure that you tap this in. What I do is I take just a little beater screwdriver that I have, put it in the center right here where that little indent is, and I tap it through, so that way as you're pulling the wheel bearing off, the axle is pushing back and you could separate easy. So here's what the backing plate looks like with it off the vehicle. All right, so that has the whole assembly, and on the back side is the wheel bearing. The whole thing's a wheel bearing, but that right there is where we're going to be beating this from. So before we do that, I want you to take a listen to this here. All right, it's really hard to move this, and you can hear that grinding in there. That's what that noise is coming from, that grinding in there. That wheel bearing should not make that noise. And for comparison, here's our brand new Timken wheel bearing. You don't hear any of that noise. That's been nice and free, it's smooth, no noise whatsoever. So I'm confident that that wheel bearing in the back is the problem. Okay, so like I said earlier, with this out, I'm not going to take the emergency brake drum off. So what I'm going to end up doing is, first thing you need to do is obviously hit it with some good penetrating fluid there, so that way this will release from the backing plate here. And then what we're going to do is basically just beat the hell out of it. We're going to take this is the wheel bearing. You're going to hit this surface as many times as you can, try to rotate, left to right, top, bottom, like that, just so we can try to get it to come straight out. I'm going to do that off camera because it takes a little bit of force to do. And then what will happen is as this pushes through, it'll come out on this side. All right? So it'll come out on this side. There's plenty of room for it to pop through. And I'm going to get at that. And then when this is off, we'll put the new bearing back on and we'll start reassembly. All right, so basically the new wheel bearing just pops in the same way the old one popped out. All right, you want to make sure that when you put it in, that you're putting it in, you see that little clip that's right there. That's where that ABS sensor connector is going to plug into. It's going to plug into on the back side of this. So just make sure that that is pointing to the front of the vehicle when you put it back on there. All right, so I'm going to put this all back together. Basically, we just put the backing plate back on here. One tip though is to get 2 of these screws in from the back side first, and then that'll align your plate, and then you could start those by hand, so that way it makes it a little bit easier to put everything back together. You could start those by hand and then get the other 2 in, and then tighten everything down. Obviously you have to line the axle in there, just make sure everything lines back up. And then what I would definitely do is to make sure that each one of these 4 bolts here has some Loctite on them, because you don't want those things breaking loose or coming loose at all. Make sure that you put that ABS sensor back in, the cable here, and then clip that back in, and then put that 13 millimeter bolt back in here. Okay, so everything's back together now. We got the caliper back on there. We got the axle nut back on, torqued down. We got the axle nut keeper. We have a cotter pin back in there. So basically, the only thing to do is put the tire back on and take this thing for a ride to see what happens. That's 50. No noise. So I hope this video helped you out, and if it did, do me a favor, give me a like, comment below, and share with your friends. Consider subscribing to the channel because we're going to have much more content like this. Keep an eye out for a video on a walk around for this Jeep too. And Snotty over here is on deck, so stay tuned to the channel. I hope everybody's well, and I'll catch you in the next video.